Many of you will know this song called No Surprises from OK Computer, the third studio album by English rock band Radiohead. You may not know that the song lyric, "No alarms and no surprises, please," is one of the most repeatedly tweeted English phrases from the St. Petersburg-based Troll Factory, responsible for 2016 US election interference, the Internet Research Agency, or IRA. Music lyrics feature prominently in troll tweet lexicon of the IRA. Radiohead is the most tweeted English language band in the IRA dataset. 30 Seconds to Mars lyrics also have a strong representation throughout the IRA Hottest 100. Perhaps in a troll factory, good noise-cancelling headphones are just necessary to power through the day with minimal distraction. Maybe IRA operatives just tweeted what they were listening to as white noise distortion, like any other keyboard warrior. Or maybe the reason was less prosaic. Sock puppet troll accounts seek to influence by amplifying divisions, building a following from cultural cues, and then demoralising people and degrading institutions. One key way to do this is to draw upon emotions and effective people-centred polarities. Music, one of the most powerfully emotional forms, seemed to have been deployed to do this. War, like pop, will eat itself. In an era of strategic competition, we are immersed in what the Grug has called persistent cyber warfare, which involves the exercising of cyber power and where cybercraft increasingly replaces statecraft, where K-pop replaces K-troop. The tools that can be used to assert national power and influence are changing, but the organisation of national institutions has been slow to respond. As Dr. Paul Lieber suggests, for 2 decades and counting, the approach to attacking information-related problems remains driven by definition and doctrine. Governments, defence and intelligence community have invested considerable human power and financial resources in defining information by the most pressing problem versus the challenge spectrum. A new systems-level approach to knowledge is now required. The crux is that a joint approach is needed to tackle information, based on authorities, adversaries and opportunities. Defence, the IC and government must move to systemic assessment approaches for information contest. Definition, doctrine, stovepipes and disciplines have created cleavages for adversaries and competitors to act effectively. The result has been a paroxysm between systems and information technologies in operation. I call this emergent reality Xeno-war. This is Clausewitz's Trinity spun up into new topologies. The portents are already here. Only the undead have seen the end of war since 1993, and the 2019 SARS-CoV-2 is an originary RNA conflict. Digital nation-states have fought below the level of armed conflict over what constitutes discrete states in an ambiguous entanglement of computational competition. Infrastructure inside national geographic borders are already under threat. However, outbreaks of disinformation and virus offer the illusions of epistemological revelation from their origins as much as confusion. This paper explores how, in a paradoxical return to the real nation-states dissolve into debordered, deterritorialised, and sovereignty emerges in a digital space, connected to citizens at individual and conspiratorial scales. Meanwhile, the popular culture dissemination of mass media meta-narrative forms and reconstructs fragmented, imagined communities. So an acronym salad to begin. This paper explores separately 2 types of analysis, both DIME, diplomatic, informational, military and economic, and PEST, political, economic, social and technological, as a means to nuance the new joint acronym of midfield, military, informational, diplomatic, financial, intelligence, economic, law and development, to show how the instruments involved convey a much broader array of options for the strategic analysis and policymaker to use. But in constant change, how do these areas intersect? In this paper, I'll examine as a micro case study how the Australian infosphere was targeted as a part of a much larger, now infamous information operation. As is widely known, in 2018, courts in the United States charged Russian organisation, the Internet Research Agency, with operations to interfere with elections and political processes. The IRA created at least 3,841 fake Twitter, often called troll accounts, and used them in a coordinated information operation with the aim to influence politics and public opinion in multiple countries from 2014 to 2017. So here I explore analysis of data and content from approximately 6,500 tweets generated by these fake accounts, with a particular focus on attempts to exert influence on Australians. In this case, I used the well-known and well-curated Clemson dataset. The US Office of the Director of National Intelligence found with a high confidence that Russian military intelligence, General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate, or GRU or GRU, was part of an influence campaign commensurate with the wider Russian Federation doctrine, where the main battlefield is consciousness, and whereby through undermining democratic norms and institutions, quote, subversion is not the prelude to war, but the war itself. So I'll begin with a dime analysis of Russian influence operations centred on the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. Dime explains national power by arranging national activity into these and outputs into these diplomatic, information, military and economic elements. In July 2014, MH17 was brought down over the eastern Ukraine. Extensive international and collaborative investigations and diplomatic efforts, including Australia, subsequently occurred 2014 to 17 and are ongoing. Following extensive investigation, the Netherlands and Australia have held Russia legally responsible for its part in downing flight MH17. A joint international open source investigation led by OSINT organisation Bellingcat identified an officer of the GRU who they alleged was integral to the delivery of the Buk missile. The MH17 incident is integral to the strategic goals for IRA actions. Flight MH17 was brought down on July 17, 2014. The following day, July 18, is the biggest single day in terms of volume in IRA tweets. The sheer volume of activity suggests an attempt to flood social media and to astroturf. This day dwarfed even those of the US 2016 election. Also, in response to the MH17 incident, the Russian Federation deployed a Cold War-style disinformation campaign in old-school mass communication forms like TV. The reason for doing so is clear. If information war and its close association with cyber measures are, as Marcus Thompson has observed, about, quote, contest for the provision and assurance of information to support friendly decision-making, quote, unquote, then a democratic society's social media environment is part of that environment. The question then arises, did the Australian political, diplomatic, lawfare and military actions in response to the downing of MH17 result in a coordinated effort to interfere within the Australian political, social media environment? This slide is about data and time. Today's analysts have to be subject matter experts in all the pillars of information operations she is tasked with integrating. Predicting actual behavioural change in the information environment requires data numeracy. This slide is a simple time series of all Internet Research Agency tweets with Auspol, MH17 and Australia mentions. These are staggered and aggregated by week. Annotations to this chart, numbers 1 to 8 in the key, show the possible correlation with the MH17 downing and diplomatic response events. How then did these accounts aim to create influence? This chart takes these three thematic groupings and explores the IRA user accounts which most activity pursued these themes in their tweeting activity. The slide shows IRA tweets and the account which tweeted them, with any of the hashtags Auspol, Australia or MH17, but not necessarily all three at once. They're reflective of which troll accounts mention MH17, who has also been tweeting about Auspol and Australia. Of note in the time series is the distinct spike of combined activity, however small, around and prior to September 17. This mirrors observations made above about Australian UN activity. It is worthwhile noting that this kind of social media data analysis can reveal not only patterns and correlations, but the character and activities of the actors involved. This chart shows the network of IRA troll accounts. The figure shows a network graph of troll accounts which tweeted with any of the hashtags OzPol, Australia or MH17. While it's clear that many accounts touched upon the topic, some accounts, those clustered in the centre of this diagram, did focus on actioning influence across all these fields and perhaps the Australian Twitter sphere more generally. This slide shows a network graph of troll accounts which tweeted with any of the hashtags OzPol, Australia, MH17, admittedly very few tweets, and looks at what other hashtags were most frequently being used by each of these troll accounts. From this, we can observe that even though their activity in Australia was small, one goal was to be influencing opinion in issues like Syria, Aleppo, Merkel, ISIS, and of course, sports. So once again, while influence in the Australian Twitter sphere was small, there is evidence of troll accounts attempting to draw Australian followers into a wider global sphere of issues and debates and vice versa. In summary, there is a strong correlation between the downing of MH17 and involvement from the GRU, and the July 18, 2014 IRA overall activity spike indicates the commencement of widespread online activity from Russian influence actors. It is important for those of us concerned with national security understand that social media intervention of this kind does not occur in isolation. Interventions in Australian social media are likely to exist on a spectrum of measures associated with kinetic deployment of assets in the air and electronic and information warfare measures, for example, in the Syrian conflict. At the same time, through 2014 and 2015, the ADF was confronted by Russian military cyber operations as the Australian government directly intervened in MH17 investigations and explored boots-on-the-ground options. What is significant is that this might have been part of a much wider, coordinated dime effort between the GRU, the IRA, and Russian diplomatic actions at the United Nations, and fake news initiatives reflected in these correlations. Twitter is just one target. Influence in the information environment is an ecology of mediums. Mainstream media, for example, provides legitimacy, and if you are unable to persuade those in the mainstream media to push your message, you have to invent them. Australian media outlets are also part of this ecology of influence, as these graphs from 2018 illustrate how they are networked with active Russian propaganda media accounts in the Australian Twitter sphere. Next, I will look deeper at the content and the character of tweets generated by fake IRA-managed accounts, with a view to understanding how they seek to generate affiliation and influence on global populations, including Australians. This chart is a time series which indicates the levels of activity of the IRA accounts, focusing on what might be identified as Australian cultural and political issues, events, and attempts to gain followers. It might be that the spikes in January and February each year are closely associated with the Australian Open and Russian tennis player Maria Sharapova, including failing a drugs test at the Australian Open in 2016, most specifically. Sandworm's involvement in the Olympic Games breach suggests the focus of these issues as a form of Russian Federation national power. The latter is plausible based on an exploration of hashtag composition of larger IRA tweet set overall, which finds sports as a focus, at least as large as politics for Australia, close to the scale as news. Sport would seem a sensible way to target an Australian online population. Attempts to gain followers in populations are often not around politics, but other topics, such as entertainment. The largest single spike for the Australian content is in February 2017. It's what we call a hashtag trolling game to seek to involve Australian followers. In February 2017 saw the IRA engage with hashtag Make TV Shows Australian, a hashtag promoted by Comedy Central program at Midnight. Midnight was an American comedy program available on Australian cable. One daily game on the show was hashtag Wars, where contestants buzzed in on a specific theme and fans could submit tweets live, which would also appear live in the show. So Russian troll accounts seized the opportunity to tweet or retweet responses to Midnight's challenge, showing a good but albeit cliched knowledge of Australian culture and humour. Tweets like hashtag make TV shows Australian Game of Thongs at midnight, Streinfeld and Sydney Opera House of Cards wove sort of Australianisms into international hit show titles. Some, like the Hemsworth brothers Karamazov, hashtag make TV shows Australian at midnight, suggested that the trolls themselves were not just selecting or copying tweets from Australians, and ones that they thought would amuse Australians, but making them up themselves with some Russian content. Several of the tweets touched on politics, like Down Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull in the middle, and American Drongo, the story of Trump. The last one came with an additional comment, sorry he's such a dick to you Aussies, ! Confirming these tweets were aimed at Australian audiences who were receiving them in the prime time evening period. The intention was to target Australians who might be subsequently encouraged to like or follow Russian accounts as a flow-on effect of this cultural online play. Indeed, as the night wore on, trolls began to interlace their jokes about Agents of Sheila and Beer Eye for the Straight Guy with more sinister messages. As this data shows, nefarious influence on platforms like Twitter is activation through a process of building networks of association through cultural familiarity, then spiking the stream with divisive or content aimed at destabilising national social cohesion. This can happen on a short time scale of a few hours, as in this case, or longer ones, perhaps over many years, as critical views are slipped into what initially seemed like innocuous feeds. It is a technique used not only by Russia, but other actors, including most recently China. As is widely known, at the same time as the activities I've outlined here were happening in Twitter, we were also witnessing other significant cyber intervention and disruption, such as hack and leak operations that became such an infamous part of the 2016 US election. Indeed, Australia is integral to the planetary information ecosystem. I recently confirmed by discussions with those involved that it was an Australian InfoSec community, it was the Australians in the InfoSec community via Twitter that broke and eventually made viral the important 2016 news of the shadow brokers to the wider world. Meanwhile, Sandworm launched a series of cyber attacks on infrastructure in the US and Europe and even Korea. And with the Five Eyes, Australians impersonated young, middle-aged men in chat rooms to undermine ISIL in Operation Glowing Symphony. We tend to see, define and respond to these kinds of activities as distinctive and separate. One is a hack and leak aimed at altering an election result and managed by cyber and security agencies. One is an attack on critical infrastructure and subject to legislation drafted by departments responsible for utilities and corporate governance. One is an attack on military targets and a matter for defence. Another happens on Facebook or Twitter and is a province of media and communications entities and regulators. We're so focused on the targets, we're missing the bigger field of battle. What if all these activities were part of a single, larger strategy? John Hultquist, the head of FireEye intelligence analysis team, was not only the first person to connect Sandworm to the GRU, he realised its larger purpose. As Andy Greenberg explains it, he could see that there wasn't some line between the influence operation of election meddling and disruptive attacks on infrastructure. All of it was an influence operation. Quote, "It's not about turning out the lights," he said. "It's about letting people know you can turn out the lights." As we have learned from studying the intrusions of nation-state actors, the primary goal is not to shut down infrastructure. It is to undermine trust and confidence in the structures and relationships that hold our society together. Cultural and social cohesion, the public-private partnership, and the idea of government itself. It is influence. So there is a need to shift our understanding and actions towards this larger intent, seeking to understand culture, connections and relationships as intrinsic to continuous, consistent, multi-front cyber warfare, seeing all these cyber actions as strategic and connected demands that we undertake a more concerted, strategic, multi-layer assessment. Intelligence and influence campaigns both require bootstrapping, strategic redesign in the current era. Collection, timing, targeting, audience, and effect all require reimagining. Most importantly, reflexive realignment around the Moiba strip of action and collection in current information environment means stepping away from behavioural certainty. One response has been strategic multi-layer assessment and the Pentagon Joint Staff Housed Initiative, geared at an interagency and to include beyond the US approach to solving critical information operations and cyber problems. This matters as much in offence as defence. As Dr. Paul Lieber has argued via one key example, quote, "These issues became apparent in the past struggles of the Strategic Communications Roadmap. How can DoD successfully communicate in a strategic fashion with A, public affairs in one direction, B, information and psychological operations in another, and finally C, key leader engagements executed by DoD senior leaders and State Department diplomatic frameworks on a third? None were truly accountable to each other, ordered to strategise for combined effect or tasked to consider a horizon beyond individual doctrine and authorities. In 2005, US Central Command attempted a solution. It established a Joint Strategic Communications Directorate for its Chief of Staff. Echoing above, its purpose blended with US Central Command's public affairs, with both functions sometimes confused on role. Information operations ultimately assumed a separate path and is now grouped with other DoD combatant commands. Information capabilities in hopes of a unified approach emerging. Sadly, another missed opportunity to ask needed questions as to what a bigger DoD information and influence picture should look like. In Australia too, the most effective response to these threats will be deconflictation, coordinated information sharing and rapid real-time capacity to identify, analyse and counter continuous threats. For example, social media is currently studied largely within the frame of media and the cycle of elections. However, using data analysis, this paper suggested that the Australian military and diplomatic efforts might have correlated with increasingly coordinated interventions into the Australian political social media. Australian responses to the downing of MH17 may have seen, admittedly a minor, interference in Twitter Ozpol, cyber measures against the ADF, and Australian topic content from known disinformation operations. It is wise to be cautious and not overstate either the scale or the effect of these measures. However, when they are known to operate amongst a broad spectrum of coordinated efforts, it may be worthwhile for the Australian government to explore ways to monitor and check these emergent effects. While these interventions have been comparatively small, they require an agile, ongoing response and situational awareness from government. Current Commonwealth arrangements are not well configured to deal with tactical or strategic information operations in our democracy. A sustainable, interoperable, interagency whole-of-government response is required. The urgency of this work grows daily as we become more and more aware of how global politics and society surge through ever shorter cycles, as the eternity politics of the Trump era is once again replaced by the Obama-esque politics of inevitability, which eternity politics had itself replaced. Meanwhile, the everyday lives of citizens are harvested for future cyber priming and offensive action. Future AI will use social media data generated, manipulated and captured now in 2020 to train systems and target people in 2035. Not only will data be a military objective in the future, it already is. The targeting of the LOAC, Law of Armed Conflict, will expand. Rather than war being a human activity, all human activity is now war. This is a new state of conflict I call xeno-war. The seeds of discord are sown years in advance on the platforms we've been discussing today. For example, in 2018, we noticed in a geographically specific areas of Facebook and Instagram the increasing prevalence of anti-vaxxer, even Russian-inflected 5G niche conspiracy activity. In the Australian social media environment, these seemingly fringe social media issue nodes had a continual, if minimal, presence in the 4.5 million Australian tweets we examined in the month before the last federal election, but not overly intrusive. Now, with the hindsight of the COVID-19 era, where conspiracy has gone mainstream, These prior insights reveal their potential for kinetic social disruption outside cyberspace. So, in conclusion, the discussions and decisions of 2020 will shape a world where social media impacts extend far beyond current definitions of influence and misinformation. Social media and foreign interference have become a means through which power can be exerted not only in the present but towards future geostrategic goals. The issue for democracies is to maintain cybersecurity and digital sovereignty in a time where traditional boundaries of nation become unclear and degrade, legal parameters are blurred, and policy constraints lag. In those times, technological knowledge, digital literacy, and social and cultural identity will need to become fused into cohesive principles with national objectives to ensure the safety of a strategic society and a nation's digital sovereignty and borders. Democracies play by the rules. They work within mutually agreed resource, moral and environmental constraints. But stack-style, planetary-scale entities and other kinds of states may not. Government needs to understand how its management of all these cyberspace domains and coordination of its own strategic analysis and defence capacities at the broader scale play a significant role in ensuring we take an integrated approach to social cohesion, economic stability, defence and security. Persistence and consistency need to be applied across the whole of government, not within siloed departments that are a relic of sovereignty and security frameworks of the 20th century. This is an era of endless alarms and surprises. We have gone from the era of responding to most pressing alarms to an ever-present, persistent form of surprise.